It was a quiet Saturday morning when the sun began to rise over Oak Ridge Lane, a small and peaceful neighborhood where everyone's lawns were trimmed to perfection and every mailbox looked exactly the same. Birds sang softly, the air was cool, and the streets were empty except for one black sedan that turned slowly into a familiar driveway. The driver, Mark Dawson, had just finished a long and exhausting night shift at the courthouse. His eyes were heavy, his tie was loose, and all he wanted was a few hours of sleep and a cup of coffee. He parked his car like he had done hundreds of times before, right in front of his garage in his own driveway. But before he could even open the door, a sharp voice cut through the calm morning air. "You can't park there." Mark turned his head and saw her, Karen, the new HOA board member who had moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago and made it her personal mission to protect community standards. She was standing across the street in her robe, clutching her phone, already recording as she walked toward him. Her hair was tied in a tight bun, her eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting prey. "Excuse me," Mark said softly, stepping out of his car. "You heard me?" Karen snapped, her tone sharp and cold. "That vehicle violates our HOA regulations. Driveways are for temporary parking only. You can't leave it there overnight." Mark sighed quietly, running a hand through his hair. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted peace. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "this is my driveway, my car. I've lived here for 15 years. I'm not breaking any rule." But Karen's face twisted with that familiar expression of superiority he had seen 1,000 times before. People who believed authority was their right, not their responsibility. "Rules are rules," she said, lifting her phone higher. "You're blocking the community's visual harmony. I'll be reporting this immediately." She began typing something into her phone. Mark leaned against his car, too tired to argue. He'd seen worse people in court. Louder, angrier, and far more unreasonable. But there was something different about Karen. It wasn't just anger. It was a hunger to control. A kind of energy that only came from people who thought the world owed them obedience. "You go ahead," Mark said quietly. "Do what you think is right." Karen frowned, as if his calmness offended her. "Don't test me," she hissed. "I know my rights." "I'm sure you do," Mark replied. He walked toward his front door, but her voice followed him. "You think you can ignore me? You'll regret that. I'm calling the police right now." He stopped. For a moment he thought she was bluffing. But then he heard it, the faint dialing tone, her voice giving the dispatcher his address. She really was calling 911 over a parked car. Mark turned around slowly, resting his hands in his pockets. "You're calling the cops?" he asked, half in disbelief, half in amusement. "Yes," she said confidently. "This is a violation of community safety. You can't just park wherever you want." Mark wanted to laugh, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded once and said, "All right, let's wait then." 10 minutes later, the faint wail of sirens echoed through the calm neighborhood. Curtains shifted in nearby houses as curious neighbors peeked out. Karen straightened her posture, trying to look official, like a soldier ready for inspection. Mark simply stood beside his car, leaning against the hood, his face calm, his breathing steady. The patrol car rolled up slowly, stopping at the curb. The door opened and Officer Daniels stepped out. A tall, broad man in his 40s with kind eyes and a badge that caught the morning light. He had seen plenty of ridiculous calls before, but this one looked strange even by his standards. "Morning," he said, glancing between the two of them. "Who made the call?" Karen immediately raised her hand. "I did, officer," she said proudly. "This man is parking illegally on community property. He's been warned before." Mark looked at her, then at the officer. He didn't say a word. Officer Daniels frowned slightly and looked at the car, then at the driveway. "This is his house?" "Yes," Karen replied quickly. "But HOA rules forbid overnight parking. It's against the guidelines." Daniels blinked. "Against the guidelines?" "Yes," she insisted. "We have rules for a reason, officer. He's breaking them." Daniels walked slowly toward Mark, but before he could speak, His expression changed. His eyes widened with recognition. "Judge Dawson?" he said, almost smiling. Karen froze. "Morning, Daniels," Mark said quietly. "Long night." "You could say that," the officer replied, trying to suppress a grin. "Didn't expect to see you here." Karen's head snapped between them. "Wait, Judge? What judge?" Daniels turned to her, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, this man is Judge Mark Dawson of the county courthouse. And this," he pointed to the driveway, "is his private property." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her face turned pale. I didn't know," she stammered. Daniels continued, "There's no legal violation here. HOA guidelines are not criminal law. This is a civil issue at best, and it doesn't warrant police response." But the rules," she sputtered. "We have to enforce them." "That's not how enforcement works," Daniels said politely. "You can file a complaint through proper channels, but calling 911 for something like this isn't appropriate." Mark stayed quiet, watching her squirm. He wasn't angry. He was studying her, the same way he studied every witness who tried to twist the truth. Daniels turned back to him. "Sorry for the trouble, Judge. I'll mark this as resolved." "No problem," Mark said softly. "You're just doing your job." Karen's shoulders stiffened. "Wait, you're not just going to leave. He broke the rules." Daniels gave her a long, tired look. "Ma'am, with respect, this isn't a police matter. And honestly, you might want to be careful about filing false or excessive emergency calls. That can be serious." She stepped back, clutching her phone tighter. Her mouth trembled slightly, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "You'll regret this," she hissed quietly at Mark as the officer got back into his car. Mark didn't respond. He simply turned toward his house, walked up the porch steps, and closed the door behind him. The sound of the door latch clicking was the most satisfying sound he'd heard all morning. Inside, the smell of coffee drifted through the air. He poured himself a cup, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked out the window. Karen was still standing in her driveway, fuming. He took a sip, then smiled faintly. He'd dealt with people like her before. People who thought power meant control, not responsibility. But he had no idea just how far she would go. The next day, as the sun rose again over Oak Ridge Lane, Mark stepped outside to pick up his newspaper and froze. A bright orange notice was taped to his front door. HOA violation. Parking infraction. His fine, $250. He laughed softly, shaking his head. She was persistent, he'd give her that. As he pulled the paper down, he noticed Karen across the street, arms crossed, watching him like a hawk. She didn't say a word, but her smirk said everything. Mark didn't tear the paper. He folded it neatly and tucked it into his jacket pocket. If she wanted to play games, he'd let her, but he'd play smarter. That evening, as he drove to the courthouse for an emergency hearing, he thought about the absurdity of it all. A judge being fined by his own HOA for parking in his own driveway. The irony made him smile. Yet, beneath that calm smile, something deeper stirred, a quiet resolve. He wasn't just going to let it slide. The law existed for a reason, and if the HOA thought it could bend that law for personal grudges, they were in for a lesson. When he came home that night, Karen's porch light flicked on as his car approached. She was waiting again like a cat guarding territory. "Still parking there?" she called out. Mark rolled down his window, his voice calm and steady. "Still my driveway," he said, "and still not your business." "You'll see about that," she muttered. "The board will handle this." "I'm sure they will," he replied. He parked, stepped out, and went inside, leaving her fuming in the dark. Over the next few days, more notices came, each more absurd than the last. Unapproved vehicle. Improper lawn decoration. Driveway staining violation. It was clear Karen had made him her target. But instead of reacting, Mark did something else. He began documenting everything. Photos, videos, dates, times, copies of every notice. He even installed a small security camera over his garage, not to intimidate but to record the truth. Karen didn't know it yet, but every word, every threat, Every false claim was being saved. And as the days passed, the neighborhood began to notice too. People whispered as she walked by, complaining quietly about her harassment. Some thanked Mark for staying calm when they couldn't. Others began sending him their own stories, how Karen had fined them for leaving trash bins out too long or for kids' bicycles left on lawns. A pattern was forming, and Mark knew exactly what it meant. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was abusing power. And that, to him, was the worst kind of crime. One night, as he reviewed his notes under the dim kitchen light, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Judge Dawson?" the voice asked. "This is Officer Daniels. Thought you should know. We've had 3 more 911 calls from your neighbor this week. All non-emergency. Just figured you'd want to be aware." Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "Thanks, Daniels," he said. "I appreciate the heads up." "No problem, Judge. She's walking a fine line. Keep records. Just in case." "Already am," Mark replied. When he hung up, he looked out the window. Karen's lights were still on. She was pacing on her porch, talking on the phone, waving her hands angrily. He could almost guess what she was saying, complaining, plotting, feeding her ego with the illusion of authority. But what she didn't know was that the same man she was trying to destroy had the power to expose her completely. He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace. But if peace meant justice, then justice would come. That night, Mark stood by his window watching the quiet street. The moonlight touched the roofs of every house, calm and silver. Somewhere, a dog barked, and a wind chime sang softly. He took a deep breath, finished his coffee, and whispered to himself, "You started this, Karen. Let's see how it ends." Karen didn't sleep that night, her mind racing with anger and humiliation. How dare he make her look foolish in front of a police officer? In her world, power was everything, and losing face was the worst crime of all. By morning, she had already decided what she would do. The next day, when Mark stepped outside to pick up his paper, 3 new notices fluttered on his front door. The HOA logo was printed in bold red at the top, each paper filled with words like violation, fine, and warning. He read them slowly, one after another, while the wind rustled through the trees. His supposed crimes were ridiculous: improper driveway usage, failure to maintain visual uniformity, possible obstruction of community aesthetics. He smiled quietly, folded the notices, and carried them inside. He didn't react because he knew exactly what was happening. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was declaring war. Across the street, she watched him through her curtains, whispering on the phone to another board member. "He thinks he's untouchable," she hissed. "We can't let him undermine the HOA. If one homeowner gets away with ignoring us, the whole neighborhood will fall apart." The man on the other end tried to calm her down, but she wasn't listening. Power had made her blind. She spent the next few hours drafting complaint letters, sending photos, and spreading whispers about Mark to anyone who'd listen. By noon, half the block had heard her version of the story, that he was a difficult neighbor, disrespectful, even aggressive. None of it was true, but gossip has a way of traveling faster than facts. Mark, meanwhile, sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee while flipping through a thick binder of HOA regulations. He'd kept a copy from years ago when the neighborhood first formed, and as a judge, reading legal documents came as naturally as breathing. Page by page, he underlined inconsistencies, vague rules, and sections that could easily be abused by someone like Karen. "Loopholes everywhere," he muttered to himself. It was almost amusing how badly written the guidelines were, so open to interpretation that anyone with a bit of arrogance could twist them. But what she didn't know was that every fine she issued had to follow due process. And due process was something she had never respected. That afternoon, when Mark drove to the courthouse, he noticed a small crowd gathered near the HOA board office, which was really just a converted room in one of the board members' garages. Karen stood in front, clipboard in hand, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We must maintain order," she declared. "No one gets exceptions. Even if someone thinks they're above the rules, we'll remind them who runs this community." Her words were sharp, rehearsed, and full of pride. The neighbors nodded half-heartedly, some agreeing out of fear, others out of exhaustion. Mark slowed his car as he passed, their eyes meeting for a brief second. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile, it was a challenge. That night, another letter arrived in his mailbox, this one stamped, urgent. It stated that his next HOA hearing would be scheduled within 3 days and that failure to attend could result in additional penalties or even property restrictions. He placed the letter on his desk, turned on his small recorder, and said quietly, "Evidence log. Day 3, notice number 6. Escalation confirmed." His voice was calm, his tone controlled, but behind his eyes there was fire. He wasn't angry in the way most people would be. His anger was quiet, focused, patient, the kind that wins battles not by shouting, but by waiting for the enemy to expose themselves. Meanwhile, Karen's obsession grew. She began walking the streets every morning with her phone camera, recording every driveway, every lawn, every car. She'd make notes about garden decorations, mailbox colors, and even trash bin placements. The neighborhood started to call her the Hawk. Some avoided her. Others whispered when she passed. But she didn't care. She thought she was restoring order. In her mind, Mark was the villain, an arrogant man who needed to be taught a lesson. She imagined how sweet victory would feel when she finally forced him to admit she was right. She wanted control, and she would get it even if it meant breaking the rules herself. 3 days later, the HOA meeting took place. The room smelled of coffee and old carpet. Folding chairs were lined in rows, and the HOA board sat behind a small plastic table at the front. Karen stood proudly in the middle, wearing a navy blazer and holding a thick folder of evidence. Mark entered quietly, taking a seat in the back. A few neighbors turned to whisper, recognizing him but too nervous to say anything. The meeting began with the usual introductions, but the tension was already heavy. Karen started reading off her notes, speaking with the confidence of someone who believed every word she said was gospel. "This homeowner," she said loudly, pointing at Mark without even looking up, "has repeatedly violated our parking guidelines, ignored written warnings, and displayed an attitude unbecoming of a responsible member of this community." Mark raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. He wanted to see how far she'd go. He also failed to seek approval for driveway modifications and neglected to maintain his exterior lighting, she continued. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Even they could tell she was reaching. When one of the board members, an older man named Greg, cleared his throat and asked, "Do we have proof of these violations?" Karen quickly flipped through her papers. "Of course," she said, showing blurry photos and half-filled complaint forms. "As you can see, those are from last month," Greg interrupted. "And they're not even from his house." Karen's face tightened, but she recovered quickly. "Well, the point is, he's setting a bad example." At that moment, Mark stood slowly. The room went silent. "May I speak?" he asked politely. Karen frowned but nodded stiffly. Briefly, he walked to the front, his calm voice filling the small space. "I appreciate the board's time," he said. "However, I'd like to clarify that none of these alleged violations have any legal basis. Furthermore, I've recorded and documented every notice, every message, every encounter since this began." He placed a small USB drive on the table. On this drive are video and audio recordings of every interaction, including the police visit you initiated over my parked car. Karen's face turned red. "That's not relevant," she barked. "Actually," Mark said softly, "it's very relevant, because it shows a pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and misuse of HOA authority." Gasps filled the room. Karen tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "You can't accuse me of that." "I'm not accusing," he said evenly. "I'm presenting facts. The law will decide the rest." After the meeting, word spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had been silent began to talk. One by one, people came forward with their own stories. How Karen had fined them unfairly, threatened them, or embarrassed them in public. Someone even printed flyers calling for a new election of HOA board members. The perfect control she thought she had was slipping away. That night, Karen sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers, her eyes red from frustration. Her husband tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. "He's turning everyone against me," she muttered. "He's dangerous." Her husband sighed. "Maybe you should back off, Karen. He's a judge. This could get serious." She glared at him. "No. He thinks his title makes him untouchable. I'll show him that HOA rules apply to everyone, even him." But deep down, fear had started to bloom inside her. The kind of fear that whispers in quiet moments, the fear of losing control. She started checking her windows more often, deleting old emails, and making late-night calls to board members to clarify records. The more she tried to fix things, the more tangled her lies became. Meanwhile, Mark continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He went to work, greeted his neighbors, and mowed his lawn every Sunday morning. But behind that calm smile, his plan was moving quietly, piece by piece. He wasn't rushing. He was letting her tighten the noose herself. When she sent another fine, he paid it immediately, keeping every receipt. When she sent threatening messages, he saved them. He was building a wall of truth so strong that when it fell, it would crush everything built on her false power. By the end of the week, Karen received a letter that made her heart stop. It was from the county clerk's office, stamped with the official seal. The subject line read, "Notice of Investigation, HOA Complaint Inquiry." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a short paragraph explaining that multiple residents had filed complaints regarding HOA misconduct and that an official review had been opened. For the first time, she felt small. Her confidence cracked. But even then, she couldn't let go. "He did this," she whispered. "He's behind all of it." She looked out her window at his house, the lights glowing softly through the curtains. This isn't over. Across the street, Mark sat in his study, reviewing documents under a warm lamp. He had just received confirmation that the inspector's office would begin reviewing the HOA's actions within the next week. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the faint sound of crickets outside. His voice was calm, almost tired, as he whispered to himself, "Justice always finds its way, even in quiet neighborhoods." He closed his folder, turned off the light, and went to bed, unaware that the storm he had quietly allowed to build was about to reach its breaking point. The night of the next HOA meeting came heavy with tension, the kind of air that feels thick before a storm. The community hall was small, built years ago beside the playground, with its dim yellow lights buzzing softly and rows of plastic chairs lined in perfect order. By 7 o'clock, almost every seat was filled. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some curious, some nervous. All of them tired of the endless drama that had turned their peaceful street into a stage for one woman's pride. Mark arrived quietly, wearing a simple shirt and coat, no sign of authority, just another resident trying to exist in peace. He took a seat near the back, his calm expression hiding the sharp awareness behind his eyes. He had been through countless hearings, seen tempers explode, lies crumble, and truth break through the noise. Tonight felt no different. Only smaller, more personal. At the front stood Karen, standing tall behind the HOA table, her folder thick with printed papers, complaint forms, and photographs. Her hair was pulled tight, her lipstick sharp, and her smile as thin as glass. When she looked around the room, she saw herself as the hero, the woman defending order against chaos. When she saw Mark, that smile twitched, but she quickly masked it, tapping her notes like a gavel. The meeting began with small talk, minutes from the last session, community updates no one cared about. But everyone was waiting for one thing, the showdown. Karen finally cleared her throat and said, "Next topic, homeowner violations." The room grew silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop spinning. She lifted her paper and began to read. Homeowner Mark Dawson has repeatedly violated Section 3A of the parking regulations, Section 5B regarding driveway aesthetics, and Section 2C concerning overnight vehicle storage. Her voice echoed through the room, steady and cold. Despite repeated warnings, he continues to ignore the HOA's authority. We must take action before others believe they can do the same. A murmur rolled through the audience. Some looked at Mark, others stared at the floor. One man whispered, "It's his own driveway, for God's sake." And another woman nudged him to be quiet. Karen continued reading, her tone growing harsher with every sentence. "We cannot let one person disrespect our rules. If we allow this, the community will fall into chaos." Mark finally raised his hand. "May I respond?" he asked politely. Karen frowned. "You'll have your turn after I finish." She read 3 more pages of accusations, each one thinner than the last. When she finally stopped, she crossed her arms and said, "Now you may speak, Mr. Dawson." Mark stood up slowly, straightening his jacket, his movements calm but deliberate. "Thank you," he said softly. "First, I'd like to clarify that no law, no local ordinance, and no binding clause in our HOA charter forbids me from parking in my own driveway. In fact," he lifted a single folded paper. "Section 3A states that driveways must remain clear for emergency access, not that homeowners cannot use them." Karen shifted in her chair, opening her mouth to interrupt, but Mark continued, his voice even. "Second, every fine issued against me was done without prior notice or written explanation, which violates HOA Procedure 12. And finally," he paused, letting the silence build, "calling emergency services over a parked car is not enforcement, it's harassment." The crowd stirred, whispers rising like waves. Karen slammed her folder shut. "That's enough," she snapped. "You're twisting the rules." Mark turned his gaze toward her, steady and unshaken. "No, I'm quoting them." The older board member Greg leaned forward, looking uneasy. "Karen, he's right about 12A. We're supposed to send written explanation first." She glared at him. "Greg, please." But her voice had lost its edge. Someone in the back spoke up. "We're tired of these fake fines. My daughter got one for painting her mailbox blue." Another voice followed. "And I got one for leaving my trash bin out for 30 minutes. The room began to hum with frustration. Karen raised her hands, shouting, "Order! Order in this meeting." But the words only fueled the noise. Mark stood still, letting the chaos speak for itself. Years of quiet patience had taught him that truth didn't need to shout. It only needed to wait. When the voices finally softened, he spoke again. "I understand you're passionate about this neighborhood, Karen," he said, his tone respectful yet firm. "But passion without fairness becomes control, and control without accountability becomes abuse." Her face turned crimson. "You don't get to lecture me on fairness," she spat. "You think because you're a judge you're untouchable?" Mark tilted his head slightly. "This isn't about titles," he said quietly. "It's about the kind of community we all want to live in. One where people talk, not threaten." His calmness only made her angrier. "You think you're clever," she said, stepping from behind the table. "But you're just another rule breaker who thinks he's special." She turned to the crowd. "This man is trying to destroy the HO," someone shouted. "He's the only one who's making sense." Laughter and murmurs followed. Karen's eyes burned. At that moment, she lost control. "You know what?" she shouted. "I'm calling the police again. Maybe they'll explain it to you." A gasp spread through the hall. Even Greg put a hand to his forehead. "Karen, please don't," he muttered. But she was already pulling out her phone. Mark didn't move. He simply looked at her and said softly, "You can make that call, but remember, every word you say tonight is being recorded. For your protection and mine." Her hand froze mid-dial. The color drained from her face as she realized he had set up a small recorder on the table beside his papers. "You can't record this," she barked. "Actually, I can," he replied calmly. "It's a public community meeting. Transparency helps everyone." For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, charged with something electric. Then an older woman in the crowd stood up. "He's right," she said. "We all deserve to know what's happening here." A man added, "We've had enough of being bullied." Another voice joined, then another, until half the room was speaking against her. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her authority, her control, everything she'd built on fear was slipping through her fingers. She tried to shout over them, but the words sounded smaller now, weaker. "You're all making a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "You'll regret this." But the people she once ruled with fines and threats were no longer afraid. Mark quietly gathered his papers and turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he looked back at her and said one sentence that froze her completely. "You might want to be careful with your accusations, Mrs. Bright. You never know who might be listening." Then he walked out, leaving the murmuring crowd behind. She stood there, breathing hard, her fingers clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Inside, fear crawled where pride used to live. The neighbors avoided her eyes as they left one by one, their silence saying more than words ever could. Later that night, Karen sat alone in her kitchen, replaying the moment in her head. The look in his eyes, calm yet unshakable, haunted her. She poured herself a drink, her hand trembling slightly. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second reminding her that her control was fading. She turned on her laptop and began typing an email to the HOA board, trying to regain her power. "We must stand united," she wrote. "This man is dangerous to the stability of our neighborhood." But the words felt hollow now, desperate. She hit send anyway, then stared out the window. Across the street, Mark's house was dark except for a small lamp glowing in the study. He was awake, working, always calm, always waiting. In that quiet darkness, something inside her began to break. Not completely, not yet, but enough to make her wonder if she had gone too far. Still, pride whispered louder than conscience. She convinced herself that she was right, that the rules mattered more than feelings, that she could still win. But deep down, she knew something had changed forever. The neighborhood no longer feared her. The man she had tried to humiliate was no longer her target. He was her reckoning. And though she didn't know it yet, the next call she made would not be the one to save her, but the one that would expose her completely. The following morning felt strangely silent in Oak Ridge Lane, the kind of quiet that follows a storm but promises another one soon. Karen woke early, dark circles under her eyes, her mind restless after a night with barely any sleep. She opened her phone and saw dozens of unread messages from board members, neighbors, and even the HOA email group. Most of them were short and sharp. "What happened at the meeting?" Or, "Is it true you tried to call the police again?" Or worse, "We need to talk about your behavior." Her stomach tightened. She could already feel her authority slipping away, like sand running through her fingers. Still, she convinced herself she was right, that Mark was the one trying to make her look bad. By mid-morning, she walked to the HOA office with her chin up and her clipboard tucked tightly under her arm. But inside, her confidence was cracking. Across the street, Mark watched quietly from his study window. He had a fresh stack of documents spread across his desk. Copies of every notice, screenshots of emails, recordings from the meeting, and a small USB drive holding the video evidence from his security cameras. He wasn't smiling, but there was a quiet calm in his face. He had dealt with people like Karen before, people who thought rules were weapons instead of guides. But this time it wasn't a courtroom filled with lawyers or reporters. It was his neighborhood, his peace, his home. And that made it personal. By noon, the county inspector's car pulled up in front of Karen's house. The words County Affairs and Community Oversight Division were printed in bold on the side. Neighbors peeked from their windows as two officials stepped out, one holding a clipboard, the other a file case. Karen stepped outside quickly, forcing a smile. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice too bright. "How can I help you?" The older inspector adjusted his glasses and replied, "We're here regarding several complaints filed about the HOA board. We'd like to review your procedures and financial records." The words hit her like a slap. She tried to laugh it off. "Complaints? About what?" "We're just enforcing the rules." The inspector's tone stayed polite but firm. "That's exactly what we're here to verify, ma'am." When the inspectors entered the small HOA office, Karen felt the walls closing in. Every file, every fine, every dollar of HOA fees she had collected was under their eyes now. They opened the ledgers, flipped through digital spreadsheets, and asked questions she didn't want to answer. "This expense here," the woman inspector said, pointing to a line on the report. $3,000 for landscaping consultation. Who approved that? Karen hesitated. "That was necessary for design review," she muttered. "Do you have the receipts?" Silence. "And these administrative fees?" the other inspector asked. "They appear to be personal payments." Her throat tightened. "Those are reimbursements," she said quickly. "For what?" he asked. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The inspectors looked at each other, noting her hesitation. "We'll need to take copies of all these documents," one of them said. Meanwhile, Mark received a short call from the inspector's office confirming that the review had started. "Thank you for your cooperation, Judge Dawson," the voice said. "Your documentation was very helpful." He only replied, "I'm not seeking punishment, just fairness." Then he hung up and looked out the window, watching Karen pace nervously on her porch as the inspectors left. For the first time, she didn't look like the queen of the neighborhood. She looked small, cornered, and uncertain. By evening, word had spread again. The whispers grew louder than ever. Neighbors gathered in small groups near mailboxes, talking quietly, glancing at her house. "I heard they found something wrong with the HOA funds," one said. "Someone said she was using money for her own stuff," another added. No one knew the full truth yet, but suspicion had already taken root. Karen closed her blinds, trying to block out the stares. Inside her house, she slammed drawers, searching for old receipts, old files, anything to defend herself. But deep down, she knew she couldn't fix this with paperwork anymore. That night, she wrote a long message to the HOA board. "We are under unfair scrutiny because of one resident's vendetta. Please stand by me as we prove our integrity." But one by one, the replies came cold, cautious, distant. "We think it's best to cooperate with the investigation. We can't be involved until the audit ends." Even her closest ally, Greg, didn't defend her. "Karen," he wrote, "maybe it's time to step back for a bit. The community is turning against us." When she read that line, her hand shook with fury. She deleted his message and threw her phone onto the couch. "Cowards!" she hissed under her breath. Across the street, Mark sat at his dining table, reviewing the day's events in silence. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He knew what was coming next. The denial, the excuses, the anger before the collapse. It was always the same pattern. He had seen it in court, and now he was seeing it in his own street. Justice didn't come loud or fast. It crept in quietly, exposing truth one piece at a time until there was nowhere left to hide. 2 days later, a formal notice arrived addressed to every homeowner in Oak Ridge Lane. It stated that the county had opened an official investigation into HOA management, citing multiple complaints of misconduct, unfair enforcement, and financial irregularities. A community meeting would be scheduled for testimony. The notice had the county seal printed in blue, and that was all it took. The neighborhood exploded in chatter. Some were shocked, others relieved. People printed the notice and taped it to their windows. The mighty HOA, once feared, now stood under scrutiny. Karen read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with rage and fear. "He did this," she whispered. "He's behind all of it." She grabbed her phone and started typing an email to the inspector herself. "This is a personal attack by one resident seeking revenge. Please disregard these lies." But when she hit send, the reply came faster than she expected. "All documentation will be verified through standard legal procedure. Please refrain from contacting county officials directly during review." Her power was slipping further away. The following morning, she marched across the street and knocked on Mark's door. He opened it calmly, wearing a neutral expression. "Morning, Karen," he said. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Her voice was trembling but sharp. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she snapped. "You think you can use your title to destroy me?" He looked at her quietly for a moment before replying. "You've already done that yourself." She stepped closer, eyes blazing. "You'll regret this." He sighed softly. "Threats won't help you now. The law will decide." Then he gently closed the door. She stood there for a long moment, fists clenched, her breath quick and shallow, before turning away. That night, the inspectors returned for follow-up interviews. They spoke to residents who had received unfair fines, and one by one, stories poured out. A retired teacher fined for having a flag on her porch, a young couple threatened over their garden color, an old man forced to repaint his fence twice because it wasn't the right shade of beige. The inspectors took notes, listening carefully. It wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about everyone she had mistreated. When the inspectors left for the final time that evening, Karen stood by her window, watching their taillights fade into the dark. The weight of silence filled her chest. She thought about the power she once held, how neighbors used to look down when she walked by, how she could make them obey with a simple notice or threat. Now they looked at her with pity, or worse, satisfaction. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. For the first time, she felt what it was like to be powerless. Across the street, Mark sat in his study, typing his final report for the county's legal team. His fingers moved slowly across the keyboard, every word deliberate, every fact precise. He didn't exaggerate, didn't mock, didn't gloat. He simply described what happened, the calls, the fines, the harassment, the meeting, the financial misuse. It wasn't revenge. It was truth. When he finished, he signed the report, saved it, and sent it to the inspector's office. Then he leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet fill the room. Outside, a soft wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves like whispers of justice approaching. As midnight approached, Karen sat alone at her dining table, staring at the glowing HOA binder lying open before her. Her reflection in the window looked tired, defeated, unrecognizable. She whispered to herself, "They can't do this to me." But deep down, she knew they could, and they already had. For the first time since she joined the HOA board, she didn't feel powerful. She felt exposed. And as the neighborhood finally went dark that night, the balance of power in Oak Ridge Lane shifted quietly. The woman who once ruled through fear now lived under its shadow, and the man she tried to humiliate had become the very symbol of the justice she thought she controlled. The morning of the hearing arrived like the slow roll of thunder before a storm. Karen woke early, her stomach twisting with dread, though she pretended it was confidence. She stood in front of her mirror, fixing her hair, straightening her navy jacket, and whispering to herself that she would win. She told herself that she had the truth, that everyone else was wrong, that the investigation was unfair. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered something she couldn't silence. What if he's there? She pushed the thought away and grabbed her briefcase filled with papers she barely understood. When she stepped outside, the neighborhood was silent. Curtains moved slightly as her neighbors watched her walk toward her car, but no one waved. Even the ones who once stood beside her now stayed hidden behind blinds. The air was heavy with judgment. The courthouse stood tall and still, its marble columns gleaming under the pale morning sun. Karen parked her car far from the entrance, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her folder. She kept rehearsing in her mind how she would speak, what she would say, that this was all a misunderstanding, a smear campaign, an act of revenge from a stubborn homeowner. She entered the lobby and went through security, the sound of her heels echoing across the cold floor. The clerk handed her the docket sheet, and when she saw the case title, her throat tightened. County of Madison versus Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, represented by Karen Bright. Her name looked small under the bold letters, and for the first time it didn't feel powerful. Felt exposed. When she entered the courtroom, her confidence wavered completely. The room was filled with quiet murmurs. A few residents sat in the back, whispering softly, their eyes curious but not sympathetic. She walked to the table, placed her folder down, and tried to steady her breathing. The bailiff's voice broke through the tension. "All rise." Everyone stood. The door behind the bench opened slowly, and the judge entered, robes flowing like shadows under the morning light. When Karen lifted her eyes and saw his face, the world tilted. It was Mark Dawson. Her mouth went dry, Her knees locked. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. "No," she whispered under her breath. But it was real. The same man she had mocked, insulted, and humiliated for weeks now sat above her. Not as a neighbor, but as a judge. Mark looked composed, his face unreadable, the perfect mask of professionalism. But there was something in his eyes. Not anger, not revenge, but quiet certainty. The kind of look that made it clear that this was not a coincidence. Justice had simply come full circle. The courtroom was silent except for the soft rustle of papers. Karen felt every pair of eyes on her, watching as the bailiff announced, "Presiding Judge Mark Dawson, please be seated," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the room. Karen lowered herself into her chair slowly, gripping the edge of the table to keep her hands from shaking. She couldn't look at him for long. Every time their eyes met, guilt burned through her. Mark opened the file before him, reading through the documents with quiet focus. "This case," he began, "concerns allegations of misconduct, harassment, and mismanagement of community funds by the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association." His voice was steady, professional, without emotion, but every word struck like a hammer. "We will proceed with witness testimony and evidence review." Karen's attorney, a thin man she had hired in panic 2 days earlier, tried to start with a defense. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, that procedures were followed, that fines and warnings were standard. But when Mark asked for proof, none came. "Do you have documentation of notice delivery?" Mark asked. "No, Your Honor." "Receipts of fund allocation?" "We're still collecting them." "Any written permission for board expenditures?" "Not at this moment." The answers grew weaker with each question. Karen sat beside her lawyer, her lips pressed tightly together, her hands trembling under the table. She could feel her power slipping away with every word. When it was time for the witnesses, several residents stepped forward. One by one, they told their stories, calmly, truthfully, painfully. The elderly veteran explained how she had fined him for displaying the national flag, calling it visual disruption. A young couple described how she threatened to sue them for planting flowers without permission. A retired teacher spoke softly about how Karen yelled at her in public over a small lawn ornament. Each story painted the same picture, a woman who had used authority like a weapon, not a duty. Karen tried to interrupt, but Mark raised his hand gently, stopping her. "You'll have your chance to speak," he said, his tone polite but firm. When it was Mark's turn to review evidence, he didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't show satisfaction. He simply laid out the facts. He played short audio clips from HOA meetings. Karen's voice loud and sharp, calling people names, threatening fines, demanding obedience. He showed copies of financial statements where HOA money had been transferred to personal accounts labeled as administrative costs. The evidence was cold and undeniable. The courtroom stayed silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to crush air itself. Karen stared down at her hands, unable to lift her head. Her lawyer leaned toward her and whispered, "We should request recess." But before he could, Mark spoke again. "Mrs. Bright," he said, his tone even, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Then her voice broke, trembling between pride and desperation. "I was only trying to protect the neighborhood," she said. "I followed the rules. People were ignoring the standards. I didn't mean for things to go this far." Her words fell into the air like weak paper. Mark listened quietly, then said, "Rules exist to guide, not to punish. When authority becomes personal, it stops being service, it becomes tyranny." His words hung in the air, heavy, final. Karen felt tears sting her eyes. "You think I'm a monster," she said softly. "I think," Mark replied, "you forgot what responsibility means." He looked down at his papers, then back at her. "I'm not here as your neighbor. I'm here as a judge. And as a judge, I am bound to the law." He turned to the clerk. "The court finds sufficient evidence of misconduct and abuse of power. Restitution will be ordered to the affected residents. And the board is to be dissolved pending re-election under county supervision." The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the courtroom. One sharp, final hit that felt like thunder after weeks of tension. Karen closed her eyes as the sound rang in her ears. It was over. The power, the pride, the control, all gone in a single moment. Her lawyer whispered something, but she didn't hear. She only heard the slow, fading hum of her own heartbeat. When she opened her eyes, Mark was signing the judgment form, his pen steady and deliberate. Then he looked up at her one last time. "Justice," he said quietly, "isn't about winning or losing. It's about setting things right." And then he stood, signaling the end of the hearing. As the courtroom emptied, Karen sat frozen in her chair, staring at the wooden table. Neighbors walked past her silently. Some glanced at her, others didn't bother. No one offered sympathy. She gathered her papers slowly, her hands shaking. The sound of her heels echoed again. But this time, it wasn't confidence. It was the hollow rhythm of defeat. When she stepped outside, the bright sunlight felt harsh, unforgiving. Across the street from the courthouse, Mark stood near the steps, talking quietly with a county officer. She froze when she saw him, but he didn't look at her with anger. His face was calm, almost sad, like someone who had seen too much of human pride crumble under its own weight. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but her voice wouldn't come. She turned away, walking to her car, the world feeling strangely small now. The weight of everything she had built was gone, replaced by a silence that followed her like a shadow. As she drove away, the courthouse disappeared behind her, but his voice stayed in her mind. Rules exist to guide, not to punish. That night, as the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, Oak Ridge Lane felt different. For the first time in years, there was peace. The residents sat on their porches without fear of another fine or warning. Children played again in driveways that once carried threats of violations. And in one house, across the street from where Karen had ruled with pride, a man sat by his window with a cup of coffee, watching the calm return. Mark didn't smile, but there was quiet satisfaction in his eyes, not because he had won, but because justice had been restored. The storm had passed, leaving behind silence and lessons carved deep into everyone's hearts. The days after the hearing passed slowly in Oak Ridge Lane, like the quiet after a long war. The neighborhood was calm now, almost too calm, the kind of silence that carries both relief and memory. For years, people had lived under the shadow of rules written in Karen's voice, afraid of letters in red envelopes and warnings taped to their doors. Now the signs were gone, the fear had faded, and the streets finally felt free again. But for Karen, the world had changed in ways she couldn't control. Her once perfect image had shattered, and every time she stepped outside, she could feel the weight of every pair of eyes watching her. The same people who used to greet her with forced smiles now looked away or whispered quietly when she passed. Her mailbox overflowed not with reports or fines but with silence. Every morning she tried to act normal, watering her plants, sweeping her porch, pretending everything was fine. But inside she knew the truth was spreading faster than she could hide from it. News of the court case had reached the entire town. Not through gossip this time, but through headlines. The local paper ran the story under the title "Judge Rules Against HOA Abuse, Justice for Oak Ridge Residents." It included quotes from the hearing, testimony from neighbors, and a short, emotionless statement from her attorney. Her name was there in black and white, tied forever to the word misconduct. When she saw it, her hands trembled. She tore the paper into pieces, but the truth stayed, printed in everyone's memory. Across the street, Mark sat in his study, the sunlight falling softly through the window onto his desk. He wasn't reading law files anymore. Instead, he was sorting through letters, thank you notes from neighbors, words of gratitude from people he had never really spoken to before. "Thank you for standing up for us. We feel safe again. You reminded us what fairness really means." He read each one quietly, humbly, setting them aside without pride, because in his heart, it wasn't about winning. It was about restoring balance. Still, a small part of him felt the weight of it all, the exhaustion of carrying justice even when he never wanted to fight in the first place. As the days turned into weeks, The county finished its audit of the HOA's finances, and the results painted a darker picture than anyone expected. Thousands of dollars were missing, spent on consulting, fees, and renovations that never happened. Karen had used HOA funds to pay for personal luxuries, a new fence, garden upgrades, even spa visits under community wellness expenses. It wasn't just arrogance. It was theft. When the report was made public, her world collapsed completely. The county ordered her to pay restitution to the homeowners, and her bank accounts were frozen for investigation. For someone who once believed she controlled everything, the loss of control felt like drowning. She stopped going outside for a while, staying behind drawn curtains, watching from the shadows as life went on without her. The once bustling woman with the clipboard was now just a ghost in her own house. Even the board members who once supported her avoided contact. Greg, the one who had once defended her, sent her a short letter. "I hope you find peace someday." That was the last anyone heard from him. The HOA board was dissolved, new elections scheduled under county supervision, and the residents voted unanimously to bring in new leadership. Simple, kind people who wanted peace, not power. When Karen finally stepped out of her house again, she moved like someone walking through the ruins of something she had built with her own hands. The streets were clean, the lawns neat, the neighbors friendly again, but none of it belonged to her anymore. She was the past everyone wanted to forget. Children who used to hide their toys from her now played freely on driveways. The sound of laughter replaced the silence she once enforced. For the first time, she understood what she had destroyed, not with weapons, but with pride. One afternoon, as she walked to her mailbox, she saw Mark standing across the street, talking with a few residents near the park sign that once carried the HOA rules. They had taken it down after the trial, replacing it with a new one that simply said, "Welcome to Oak Ridge, a community of neighbors." It wasn't fancy, but it felt alive. When Mark noticed her, he didn't look away. He nodded once, a quiet gesture that wasn't cold or cruel, just human. She wanted to return it, to say something, anything, but the words stayed trapped in her throat. She turned back toward her house, her steps slow, the sound of laughter echoing behind her like a memory she no longer belonged to. That night, she sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the binder of HOA rules that once gave her power. The pages were wrinkled and marked with notes, the corners bent from years of use. Felt useless now, just paper without meaning. She thought about all the times she had written fines, taped notices, argued over trivial things. Flower pots, mailboxes, parking spots, and realized none of it mattered. All she had done was push people away, turning neighbors into enemies, peace into fear. She ran her hand over the cover and whispered, "I was supposed to protect them," but even she didn't believe it anymore. Across the street, Mark sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars peek through the clouds. The neighborhood was peaceful again, and for the first time in months, he could breathe easily. He thought about everything that had happened, the shouting, the calls, the courtroom, and how something so small had turned into something so ugly. It reminded him how fragile peace was, how easily pride could destroy it. But it also reminded him that justice, no matter how long it took, always found its way back home. The following week, the new HOA board held their first meeting. It was different this time. There were no threats, no shouting, no fear. People laughed, shared ideas, and made plans for a summer picnic. Mark attended quietly, sitting in the back like any other resident. When they asked if he'd like to say a few words, he simply said, "Let's remember that this community doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to all of us. Rules should protect, not punish." The room filled with nods and applause. It was simple, but it was enough. Later that night, as the lights went out one by one in Oak Ridge Lane, Karen sat by her window, watching the glow from the park where the meeting had been held. She could see people walking home, smiling, waving to each other. Something that hadn't happened in years. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she didn't bother to wipe it. She knew that no rule, no fine, no title could ever bring her back what she had lost. It wasn't the power or the position, it was respect. And respect, once gone, never returns the same. Mark, meanwhile, stood on his porch for a long time, feeling the cool breeze against his face. Somewhere behind him, a framed certificate from the courthouse hung on the wall, but he didn't look at it. Titles didn't matter here. He was just a man who loved his home and believed in doing what was right. As he looked across the street, he saw the faint glow from Karen's window and felt no anger, no pride, only quiet closure. The storm that had once raged between them had finally ended, leaving behind truth, silence, and the calm that always follows justice. Weeks passed, and Oak Ridge Lane began to heal like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. The lawns looked greener, the air felt lighter, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood sounded alive. Children played in driveways that were once empty, dogs barked freely, and laughter replaced the heavy silence that had ruled for too long. The HOA office, once a symbol of control, stood empty now, its windows dusty and its door locked. The community had voted to move meetings to the small park instead, under the open sky where everyone could see and speak freely. The heavy folders filled with fines and warnings were gone, replaced by simple notes about repairs, gatherings, and plans for a new playground. For the first time in a long time, Oak Ridge felt like home again. Mark Dawson watched this change quietly from his porch, his cup of coffee warming his hands as the morning sunlight painted golden lines across the street. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He never wanted a fight, never wanted attention. All he wanted was fairness, peace, and the right to live without fear in his own home. As he looked around, he saw neighbors waving to one another, people helping each other move furniture, kids painting signs for the new park event. Life had returned, and that was all he had hoped for. Karen, however, lived in the same house but in a different world. Her days had grown quiet, her phone rarely rang, and most people avoided her out of awkwardness more than hate. She no longer wore her proud suits or carried her clipboard. Now she dressed simply and moved slowly, as if every step reminded her of what she had lost. The mirror didn't lie. She wasn't the same woman anymore. Power had aged her, but losing it had humbled her. She had been the queen of rules, but now she was just another name in the community she once ruled. And though she never said it aloud, a small part of her was relieved. The weight of control had broken her spirit, and peace, though painful, was finally teaching her something she never understood. Respect was earned, not demanded. One breezy evening, Mark sat outside reading a book as the sky turned soft orange. Across the street, Karen stepped onto her porch, holding a small box of old papers. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no anger there anymore. No pride, no tension. Only quiet understanding. She hesitated, then walked slowly across the street, the gravel crunching under her shoes. When she reached his gate, she stopped and took a deep breath. "I came to give you this," she said softly, handing him the box. Inside were old HOA files, her notes, and a letter on top written in her neat handwriting. Mark looked at her, curious but calm. "What is it?" he asked. She gave a faint, tired smile. "Everything I used to think mattered," she said. "I don't want to keep it anymore." He nodded quietly, accepting the box. "Thank you," he said. She looked down, her voice shaking slightly. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air for a long moment. The wind rustled the trees, carrying the sound away, but it was enough. Mark didn't lecture her, didn't tell her she was forgiven or that she was wrong. He simply said, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You were always calm," she said. "Even when I tried to ruin you. I never understood why." He looked out at the neighborhood, then back at her. "Because anger builds walls," he said quietly, "but patience tears them down." She stood there for a moment longer, then whispered, "Good night, Judge Dawson." "Good night, Karen," he replied, and she turned back toward her house, the evening sun following her steps. The next morning, the neighborhood held its first big community event in years, a picnic under the old oak trees at the park. Families brought food, kids ran with kites, and music played softly from a small speaker. Mark attended quietly, sitting on the grass among neighbors who now saw him not as a judge, but as a friend. People came up to thank him, to shake his hand, to share stories about how they had been afraid to speak up before. He smiled, listened, and said little. The joy wasn't his alone. It belonged to everyone who had chosen truth over fear. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low, the same officer who had responded to Karen's 911 call months ago stopped by the park. Officer Daniels spotted Mark sitting on a bench and walked over with a grin. "Heard about the case," he said, handing him a soda. "Nicely handled." Mark chuckled softly. "Just doing what's right." Daniels laughed. "Yeah, but not many people do it this quietly." They both looked out at the park. Children laughing, neighbors sharing food, life moving on. The world looked ordinary again, and that was the best kind of ending. When Mark returned home that evening, he set the box Karen had given him on the table. He opened it slowly, flipping through the papers until he found the letter. It wasn't long, just a few sentences written in her careful, tidy script. "I used to think power made me strong. Now I know strength comes from fairness. Thank you for reminding me of that." He folded the letter, set it back in the box, and smiled faintly. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, glowing softly across the neighborhood like quiet guardians. He stepped onto his porch once more, the night air cool against his skin. Across the street, Karen's lights were off, but her front yard looked peaceful for the first time in a long while. The wind carried the faint laughter of children playing somewhere in the distance, the sound of a world that had found its balance again. Mark took a deep breath, feeling that rare kind of calm that comes when justice and mercy meet halfway. He looked up at the stars, whispered something only he could hear, and then turned to go inside. As his door closed, the street fell silent except for the soft hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves. Oakridge Lane, once torn by pride and fear, now stood whole again. Not perfect, not flawless, but real. And in that ordinary peace, there was something extraordinary. It wasn't about revenge, or victory, or punishment. It was about learning that even the smallest act of fairness can rebuild an entire world. The neighborhood had changed, but more than that, the people had. And as the night deepened and the lights dimmed, one truth remained: justice, when done with patience, always brings peace in the end.